When I saw my $1 million lake mansion turned into rubble, I thought it was a nightmare. But the real shock came when I learned who ordered the demolition, and why she's now facing federal charges. I built that home with my own hands, one brick at a time, over 3 years of late nights and weekend labor. Every screw, every plank of cedar, every window overlooking the valley reminded me what hard work was supposed to mean: peace. But the moment I stepped out of my truck and saw bulldozers where my living room used to be, I felt something inside me collapse. You know that feeling when silence is so loud it hurts? That was the air around me. No birds, no waves. Just the soft ticking of cooling metal and dust settling on what used to be my dream. And then the neighbor's voice. "Should have paid your dues, pal," she said, arms crossed, HOA badge glinting in the light. My chest tightened. "Dues," I whispered. "You think this is about dues?" She smirked. "Unpaid fees. Board decision. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." She said it like she'd forgotten that behind those shattered walls were my father's tools. My mother's old piano, the letters I kept from the year I almost gave up everything. Nothing personal. The first letter looked ordinary, just a printed envelope stamped HOA notice in neat blue ink. Inside was a charge for $1,820 labeled landscaping violations. The problem? I hadn't violated anything. My property sat half a mile beyond their boundary, technically on unincorporated land. I called their office. "This must be a mistake. My lot isn't even part of your jurisdiction." A woman on the line sighed like she'd been waiting for this argument. "Sir, our records show your driveway crosses HOA property. That makes you subject to community maintenance fees."
I laughed.
"A dirt path through the woods? That's federal easement, not your property." She paused, voice sharp now. "If you ignore this, additional penalties will apply." That was the beginning, the first spark. Weeks passed. Letters piled up, each one bolder, each one thicker. By the time the fourth notice came, it wasn't just about landscaping anymore. They accused me of unauthorized structure expansion, claiming the dock I built on the lake violated community guidelines. Except, that lake wasn't theirs. It was mine. I had the title, the survey, the documentation from the county. But none of that seemed to matter to them. Each notice came with heavier threats, late fees, court filings, and eventually, a warning that they'd take necessary action to ensure compliance. I thought they were bluffing. I wish they had been. One Friday morning I woke to the sound of engines down the hill. At first I thought someone was cutting trees. Then the rumble grew louder, deeper, until the windows shook. By the time I got outside, there were 4 trucks parked by the gate, and a yellow excavator was idling beside my driveway. I ran. My boots sank into the mud as I shouted, "Hey, you can't be here!" A man in a neon vest waved a clipboard. "We've got a demolition order." "From who?" He didn't even look up. "HOA board? You're past due." I felt my blood turn to ice. "This isn't their property." The driver shrugged. "Sir, if you have an issue, take it up with them. We just follow instructions." And just like that, the arm swung forward. The bucket hit the side of my porch. The sound was like thunder cracking open the earth. "Stop!" I screamed, but no one stopped. They tore through the living room like it was paper. My paintings, my books, the piano my mom left me, all of it crushed beneath steel. Dust choked the air. Splinters flew like shrapnel. I remember collapsing to my knees, hands in my hair, as one of the workers turned away from me, couldn't even meet my eyes. I could tell he didn't want to do it. But orders were orders. When the machines finally stopped, there was nothing left but the frame of the fireplace blackened, cracked. Still standing like a tombstone, I walked through the debris in disbelief. There was a silence that felt almost staged, like the world itself was holding its breath. And that's when I saw her again. The same woman who signed every one of those notices. The HOA president. Standing at the edge of my property line with a coffee in hand watching. "You'll be hearing from my attorney," I said, my voice shaking. She smiled like I just told a joke. "Good, so will we." That night, I barely slept. I dug through old files, scanned deeds, pulled county records, anything that proved what I already knew. And that's when I found it, the land deed that went beyond the property line. The legal boundary extended all the way down the valley, including the HOA's office, their park, and even the road they used to get to my house. They hadn't just destroyed my home. They'd done it on land I owned. I remember sitting there in shock, staring at the paper, realizing just how deep they'd buried themselves. The power they thought they had, it was all built on ground that legally belonged to me. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "You wanted a war. You just picked the wrong valley." Asterisk. The next morning, I drove straight to the county recorder's office. My hands were trembling, not from fear this time, but from fury I could barely hold in. The clerk behind the counter looked up when I dropped a stack of deets on the table. "Ma'am," I said, "I need verification on these parcels. Everyone that borders the lake." She flipped through the papers, nodding slowly. "These are valid." "Why?" I swallowed hard. "Because an HOA just tore down my house." "On that land?" Her eyes widened. "They, what?" She printed a fresh copy of the master plat map, circled the parcels in red, and slid it back across the counter. "You own all of this, not them." That single piece of paper felt heavier than a court order. It was proof undeniable. Official that everything they'd done was illegal. I walked out of that office knowing exactly what I had to do next. I called the local news. Then a lawyer. Then every neighbor who had ever whispered that the HOA went too far. Within 24 hours, the story broke. The headline read, "Homeowner's mansion illegally demolished by HOA property rights dispute shakes county." Cameras showed up at the rubble before I even had time to breathe. Reporters wanted tears, outrage, a soundbite. I wasn't going to give them weakness. I wanted truth. So when a microphone came close, I said, they called it unpaid fees. I call it destruction of private property. And now, I'm calling it justice. That clip went viral. By the next day, county inspectors, police investigators, and federal land use officers were on the scene. The HOA tried to lock their office doors. But it was too late. Every document, every board decision, every recorded meeting suddenly mattered. Meanwhile, the HOA president Herstill walked around with that same calm arrogance. She even gave her own interview. "Our association followed proper procedure," she told the cameras. This individual ignored repeated notices. The board voted unanimously. But the truth has a way of cracking facades. When investigators started checking ownership boundaries, they discovered the HOA had been overcharging homeowners for years, claiming maintenance costs on land that didn't belong to them. It wasn't just me they wronged. It was dozens of families that night. I got calls from neighbors, people who once avoided me now whispering, "We're with you." The following morning, my lawyer called. "They've crossed into federal territory," he said. "You own the valley floor and lake access. That's a navigable waterway. Federal protection applies. We're filing criminal charges." I closed my eyes and exhaled. For the first time since the demolition, I felt something other than rage control. A week later, we walked into the courthouse together. Cameras lined the steps, flashing, shouting questions. My lawyer told me to keep my head up. Inside, the HOA president sat across the aisle. Pearl earrings, perfect posture, still pretending she was in charge. But when the county surveyor unrolled the official map and the judge asked who owns the valley, her face drained of color. The courtroom fell silent as the answer echoed through the mic. "The plaintiff does." "Your Honor?" The judge leaned forward. "Then it appears this demolition occurred outside the HOA's jurisdiction entirely." My attorney stood, which makes it unlawful destruction of private property, trespass, and malicious intent to defraud. The president shifted in her seat, whispering something to her lawyer. But the gallery was already murmuring. Cameras clicked behind us. In that moment I realized this wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been bullied by people who thought a title or badge gave them power. When court recessed, I walked outside to find reporters waiting again. They wanted a reaction. All I said was, "They took my home. Now the law will take theirs." That clip became the headline the next morning. Still, I didn't feel triumphant. The nights were long. I'd walk the empty lot, flashlight in hand, sifting through pieces of wood and glass. I'd find fragments of the life I lost, a picture frame, a cracked tile from the kitchen I built myself. Each one reminded me what they'd stolen, but beneath all that wreckage, something else began to rise. Resolve. Because the valley wasn't just land, it was leverage. And I wasn't done using it. The court hearings dragged on for weeks. Every morning I'd drive past that empty stretch of land that used to be my home. The ground was still scarred where the excavator tracks had cut through the soil. I'd stop for a moment, stare at the water glinting in the distance, and remind myself that this fight was bigger than rebuilding walls. It was about reclaiming the truth. The HOA's lawyer kept trying to stall. They filed motions, challenged jurisdiction, claimed good faith. But each delay only made them look guiltier. Local papers started publishing timelines of every notice they'd sent me, every board meeting they'd held without proper notice to residents. Neighbors who'd once stayed quiet began stepping forward, telling reporters how they'd been fined for things as small as the color of their mailbox or a flower bed being 2 inches off code. One night, a man knocked on my trailer door, the only place I had to stay on the property now. He was in his late 60s, a retired engineer from the next subdivision. "I heard what they did to you," he said, holding a folder. "They tried something similar with me 5 years ago." I kept the paperwork. Inside the folder were minutes from an HOA meeting where the president had bragged about tightening control on lake properties. She'd even mentioned my parcel by number. My stomach dropped. She had targeted me long before the first notice. The next morning I handed the folder to my lawyer. He skimmed the pages and whispered, "This is premeditated. This changes everything." When we entered court that day, the energy had shifted. The judge had already seen the folder. The HOA's attorney looked nervous. The president stared straight ahead, refusing to meet my eyes. My lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, this isn't a billing dispute. This is a deliberate campaign of harassment, culminating in illegal demolition on federally protected land." Then he dropped the folder on the evidence table with a sound that cut through the whole courtroom. The judge read the documents in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but cold. "Mrs. Turner," he said to the HOA president, "these notes appear to show intent to remove the plaintiff's property to acquire control of lake access. Is that correct?" She fumbled for words. That's taken out of context." "Context," the judge interrupted, "doesn't rebuild a man's home." "Yes?" Gasps rippled through the room. The cameras caught it all. Outside, the story exploded again. News vans parked along the road. Drone shots of the valley filled every local broadcast. I watched them from the edge of my lot, listening to the anchors say my name, watching strangers online call it the biggest HOA scandal in the state. But behind all the noise, I felt something quieter. Exhaustion. The kind that sits in your bones after weeks of fighting. I didn't want fame. I wanted closure. A few days later, the county commissioner called me personally. "We're moving to dissolve that HOA," she said, "and we'll support your civil suit for damages." I thanked her, but I barely processed it. I just looked out across the valley, the same land they'd tried to control, and realized how fragile power really is. That night, I went back down to the lakeshore. The moon was low, silver on the water. I could almost see the reflection of the house that used to stand there. I thought of my parents, of the years spent building, of the noise of those machines tearing it apart, and for the first time, instead of anger, I felt peace. Because the one thing they never understood, the thing that destroyed them in the end, was that ownership isn't just paper. It's history, it's memory, it's the quiet promise you make to yourself when you decide not to give up. I turned off the flashlight, let the night swallow the valley, and whispered, "We're home again." Asterisk, when the verdict came down, the courtroom felt weightless. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, and every sound in the room seemed to collapse under it. The judge's words echoed. The Homeowners Association acted outside its jurisdiction. The plaintiff is entitled to damages and full restoration of his property rights. People started whispering the way they do when something historic happens. I didn't move. I just stared at the grain of the wooden table in front of me, trying to let it sink in. Months of tension, humiliation, sleepless nights, all of it suddenly turned into silence. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed like lightning. Someone shoved a microphone toward me and asked, "How does it feel to win?" I wanted to say it didn't feel like winning. It felt like justice trying to breathe again. But I said it's not just about me. It's about every homeowner who's been bullied into silence. That line played on every local channel for the next 2 days. My phone filled with messages from strangers, people I'd never met, thanking me, sending photos of their own HOA battles. Some of them cried on video calls, saying they'd finally filed complaints after years of fear. The county held a press conference the following week. The commissioner stood behind a podium and announced the HOA's dissolution. Behind her were boxes of confiscated files, meeting notes, financial ledgers, letters of intimidation. She said they'd uncovered over 200 instances of overbilling and harassment. The president, once the most feared woman in the valley, now faced federal charges for fraud and property destruction. Her name was everywhere: headlines, talk shows, even late-night monologues. And every time I saw her photo on a screen, I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired. Because the truth is, when you spend months fighting for something, victory doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with paperwork, lawyers, and empty rooms. I went back to my lot a few days later. The ground was still rough, patches of foundation poking through the dirt. A few reporters were there, standing by their vans, but when they saw me, they kept their distance. I walked down to the lake. The water looked calmer than it had in months. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I was finally calm enough to notice. As I stood there, a familiar voice called out from behind me. It was Lisa, the neighbor who'd always waved from across the cove but never got involved. "I'm glad you won," she said. "They scared a lot of us." I nodded. "They won't scare anyone again." "Are you gonna rebuild?" That question hit harder than I expected. I looked at the empty space where my living room once stood and said, "I don't know. Maybe I'm not rebuilding the same house." She smiled faintly. "Whatever you build next, we'll be here." The words stuck with me. We'll be here. That night I sat at my makeshift desk inside the trailer, sorting through boxes of documents. There were letters from neighbors offering donations, offers from builders, Even a message from a state representative asking to speak at a homeowner rights forum. I realized the story wasn't mine anymore. It had become a symbol. And that meant I couldn't disappear, not yet. So I agreed to one interview. National news this time. They filmed at sunset, the lake glowing behind me. The reporter asked the same question everyone else did. What do you want people to take from your story? I looked straight into the lens and said, power doesn't come from control. It comes from accountability. And if you ever feel small, remember paperwork and titles don't build communities. People do. The segment aired that weekend. It went viral overnight. Tens of millions of views, thousands of comments. Some called me a hero. I didn't feel like one, but I did feel responsible. A week later, the county issued the restitution order. The court awarded me damages that could more than rebuild the mansion. But what mattered most wasn't the money, it was the clause attached to the judgment. All remaining HOA assets, including the community park and office building, will be transferred to the plaintiff as part of restitution. For a long time, I just stared at that line. The very office where they'd voted to destroy my home now belonged to me. When I unlocked its door for the first time, dust and silence greeted me. Meeting agendas were still pinned to corkboards, coffee mugs left half full, boxes of unused forms stacked against the wall. I sat at the head of the table where she used to preside and whispered, "This is what arrogance leaves behind." But then I noticed something taped under the chair, an old note scribbled in marker. No one challenges the board. I tore it off, folded it, and tucked it into my pocket. Not as a trophy, just as a reminder. Because I knew the next step wasn't revenge. It was rebuilding. Not just my house, but the idea that people could live here without fear. So I filed a new deed with the county, transforming the entire valley, including the park and that office, into a nonprofit land trust. No HOA, no board. Just a community managed by the residents themselves. When word spread, families who'd once kept to themselves started showing up again. They brought food, tools, and stories. We spent weekends clearing debris, painting fences, and laughing in a way I hadn't heard around here for years. That's when I realized the best kind of justice is the one that gives something back. The morning I broke ground again, the valley felt different. The air was cool, sharp, with that mix of dirt and rain that only comes after a storm. Except this time. The storm wasn't in the sky, it had passed through all of us. The excavator's engine roared to life. And for a split second I froze. The last time I heard that sound, it was the noise that destroyed everything I built. My stomach tightened. My hands shook. But then I looked up and saw my neighbors lined along the hill, cheering. Kids waved small flags. Someone yelled, "We're with you this time." And that was enough. Every scoop of dirt that lifted felt like taking back a piece of what was stolen. Not just land, but dignity. I didn't rebuild the mansion exactly as it was. I didn't want a monument to what happened. I wanted a symbol of what could come next. So I designed something smaller, warmer. Glass walls overlooking the lake, reclaimed wood beams, a shared dock that anyone from the community could use. During construction, I started a series of videos. At first they were updates, time-lapses of framing and landscaping. But soon, people wanted more. They wanted the story, so I told it. Not the angry version. Not the one about revenge. The one about rebuilding after you've been broken in public. About standing back up when everyone's watching, not to prove a point, but to reclaim peace. The first video hit 1 million views in 2 days. Then 3 million. Then 10. People from across the country commented, some fighting their own HOA nightmares, others just finding hope in a stranger's story. It wasn't fame that moved me. It was the realization that pain, when shared honestly, could heal others too. Months passed, and the lake house finally took shape. Every day, I'd arrive before sunrise and leave after dusk. Hands raw from labor, but heart steady for the first time in years. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the water, I saw a familiar car pull up. It was Hertha, former HOA president. She stepped out, quieter, smaller somehow. The kind of small that comes when life humbles you in ways words can't describe. She didn't speak at first, just looked at the house, then at me. "I heard you bought the valley," she said softly. "I did," I replied. "But not to keep anyone out," she nodded, eyes glistening. "I lost everything. The house, the board, even my husband left. I just came to see it for myself." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was heavy, but not bitter, just ... honest. "I hope you find peace," I finally said. "Because I already did," she left without another word. And I realized true revenge isn't about ruining someone else's life. It's about rebuilding yours so fully that their actions don't matter anymore. By the time spring came, the community was reborn. The park we restored became the heart of the valley. Families picnicked under the trees. Kids fished from the dock. The old HOA office was transformed into a community center with glass doors, open meetings, and a big sign above the entrance, "The valley belongs to everyone." We even hosted our first town gathering there. Music played, people laughed, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the valley had healed. I walked up to the microphone as the sun began to set behind the hills. The crowd went quiet. I said, "A few years ago, this land was a battlefield. Fear lived here. Control lived here. But look around you now. This is what happens when people stand up, not just for property, but for each other." They applauded, and in that sound, I heard something deeper than victory. I heard belonging. Later that night, when the crowd thinned and the music faded, I stood on the dock alone. The water reflected the stars like a mirror, calm and endless. I reached into my pocket and took out that old piece of paper, the one I'd found taped under the chair in the HOA office. "No one challenges the board." I tore it into tiny pieces and let them drift into the water. The lake swallowed them quietly, without ripples. Then I whispered, "No one controls the valley again." A few weeks later, a letter arrived from the state. They wanted to feature the transformation of the valley as a model for homeowner reform, turning what was once a story of corruption into one of renewal. And that's when it hit me. This was never just about a house, or an HOA, or even me. It was about how Isley power corrupts when good people stay silent, and how one act of courage can break that cycle for everyone. When I look out over the water now, I don't see what I lost. I see what I earned: peace, freedom, and a community that finally learned that no piece of paper or boardroom vote could ever own the human spirit. So if you've ever been wronged, if someone tried to take what's yours, your home, your peace, your voice, remember this. They might break your walls, but they can't touch your foundation if it's built on truth. And as for me, I rebuilt everything they tried to bury. So don't just watch my story, remember it. Because one day you might need to stand up for yours. Watch till the end. Because this isn't where my story ends. It's where yours begins. Asterisk. It started with one interview, just a small local podcast that talked about community resilience. I figured maybe a few thousand people would hear it, maybe send messages of support, and that would be it. But within a week, everything changed. Clips of my story began circulating on social media, stitched together by people I'd never met. One had the caption, "The man who turned corruption into community." Another said, "This is what real accountability looks like." By the end of the month, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. CNN wanted a follow-up. A documentary producer from Los Angeles called. Even a law professor reached out, saying she was using my case in a class about property rights. I remember sitting on the dock one night, the same dock where I'd let that paper drift into the lake, watching the reflection of my house glow against the water. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a victim or even a survivor. I felt like the truth had finally found its way home. But when something grows too bright, it draws shadows. One morning, a reporter from a national paper showed up at my door uninvited. She had that look journalists get when they know there's more to the story. She said quietly, "Did you know your HOA president wasn't working alone?" I froze. "What do you mean?" She handed me a file. Inside were documents, emails between the HOA board and a regional developer. Apparently, they'd been planning to seize several properties along the lake under false pretenses. My house was just the first test. The goal? To clear the valley for a private resort project worth millions. For a moment, everything went silent again, the same silence I had heard in the courtroom, the same one that followed the demolition. Except this time, it wasn't disbelief. It was anger, sharpened into purpose. I told her I'd go on record. The article dropped 3 days later. Headline: Hidden Scheme. Developer tied to illegal HOA demolitions across multiple counties. It was like lighting a fuse. Within hours, state officials announced a formal investigation. More homeowners came forward, dozens at first, then hundreds. People from other towns, other states. Their stories echoed mine. Intimidation letters, inflated fines, secret by dash-outs. Suddenly, my inbox wasn't full of praise. It was full of evidence. And I realized this was no longer just my story. This was a movement. A few weeks later, the state attorney general invited me to testify. I didn't want to go back to a courtroom, but something inside me said I had to. The morning of the hearing, the halls were packed. Cameras lined the marble corridor. The air smelled like coffee and tension. When they called my name, I walked up and sat under the bright white lights. I could see the faces of people who'd been through the same pain, families, who'd lost everything to the same kind of greed. I took a deep breath and said, "If you want to stop corruption, you start by giving power back to the people who live with its consequences. Not corporations. Not developers. People." The room erupted in applause. Even a few officials stood. That clip went viral again, But this time, it wasn't just sympathy, it was momentum. Petitions started. Laws were proposed. And within a few months, the state passed a new bill limiting the authority of private HOAs. They called it the Homeowner Protection Act. But locals just called it the Valley Law. When I saw the governor sign it on live TV, I didn't cheer. I just sat quietly, remembering the day I stood over the rubble of my old mansion, thinking it was all over. Turns out, that was just the beginning. But fame has a funny way of bending truth. The media wanted to turn me into a symbol, the man who beat the system. They wanted headlines, sound bites, easy heroes, and I tried to play along, but deep down, I knew the truth was messier. Some nights, I still woke up to the sound of that demolition echoing in my head. Trauma doesn't vanish, just learns to sit quietly beside you. Then one day I got an email from a woman named Abigail. She lived 3 states away. Her HOA had just filed to foreclose on her home because she put up a wheelchair ramp without design approval. She said, "I watched your story every night to remind myself not to give up." That message hit harder than any award, any interview, any viral clip, so I decided to help her. Quietly, behind the scenes, I connected her with my lawyer, shared every document, every loophole I'd uncovered. 6 months later, she won. The HOA dropped the case. She sent me a photo, her ramp covered in Christmas lights. Her kid sitting on it smiling. That's when I understood. My story wasn't just a warning. It was a blueprint the next week. I launched a foundation, the Valley Initiative, to help homeowners fight unlawful HOA practices. Not through anger or revenge, but through law, through truth, through standing together. We started small. A few volunteers, a few lawyers who believed in the cause, but soon the emails turned into partnerships. And the partnerships turned into reform. Media outlets began calling it the second wave. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel alone. I went back to the lake that night, the wind moving softly over the water, and said quietly to myself, "You lost everything once. But maybe that was the only way to give something bigger back." Then, as if on cue, a light flickered across the lake, Abers laughing. The sound of music drifting from the park we built, that sound, that laughter, it was proof that we'd won more than a case. We'd reclaimed something they never should have taken in the first place, our community soul. So if you're watching this, thinking no one cares, thinking your fight is too small, remember this. I thought the same thing once. Until the day the Valley answered back. Months had passed since the state hearing, but the echoes of that day still lingered. The headlines had faded, the cameras moved on, but for me, the story wasn't over. It wasn't fame I was chasing anymore, it was peace. The lake had gone quiet again. It's a kind of quiet that feels like forgiveness. Every morning, mist would roll over the water, curling between the trees like soft smoke. I'd sit on the edge of the dock with a mug of coffee, just listening. For the first time in years, there was no fear, no anger, just stillness. That's when I started writing. Not a lawsuit, not a press statement, a book. It wasn't about the case or the demolition. It was about everything around it, the people who stood with me when I had nothing left. The neighbors who turned fear into unity, the realization that power isn't taken back with rage. It's rebuilt with integrity. The title came easily. The Valley belongs to everyone. When I finished the first chapter, I sent it to Lisa, the neighbor who'd once asked if I'd rebuild. She read it overnight and showed up at my house the next morning, eyes wet, voice trembling. "You didn't write about what they did to you," she said. "You wrote about what we did after?" I smiled. "That's the only part that matters." The book spread faster than I expected. People wrote in, saying it gave them courage to face their own silent battles, not just against HOAs, but against unfair bosses, broken systems, and even their own fears. It became less about property rights and more about personal rights. The media tried to bring the story back again. They wanted another round of interviews, another viral headline. But this time, I said no, because the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who found a piece of themselves in it. Instead, I focused on the Valley Initiative. We grew from a small foundation into a nationwide network, free legal aid for homeowners, education programs about property law, community rebuilding grants, the kind of work that didn't trend on social media, but changed lives quietly. One afternoon, I received a letter from the county office, a request to attend a public dedication ceremony. They were renaming the park. When I arrived, I almost didn't recognize the place. The once empty field was alive with families, laughter, and music. The trees we'd planted had grown tall, their branches heavy with green dot. At the center stood a simple wooden sign. It read, "The Valley Freedom Park, in honor of everyone who chose community over control." As the ribbon was cut, applause filled the air. Kids ran to the playground, neighbors hugged, and someone handed me a small piece of folded paper. It was from one of the volunteers. The note said, We don't follow leaders here. We follow kindness. I folded it into my pocket, right where I'd once kept that hateful HOA message years ago. That contrast hit me hard. It reminded me how much can change when people decide to stand up instead of stand by. Later that evening, when everyone had gone home, I stayed behind. The park lights glowed against the lake, and for a while, I just sat there. Listening to the wind ripple across the water, that's when I saw her again, the former HOA president. Not in person this time, but on the news. The reporter said she'd completed her sentence and moved to a different town. She'd been volunteering at a housing nonprofit, helping low-income families buy their first homes. For a long moment, I didn't know how to feel. But then, I smiled because maybe this was how the story was supposed to end, not with revenge, but with redemption. People change when truth finally touches them. And maybe, in some quiet way, she'd learned what real community meant too. A few weeks later, the first copies of my book arrived. I sat at my kitchen table, holding one in my hands, tracing the title embossed in gold. The last line read, "Home isn't the land you own. It's the peace you build when you stop fighting and start forgiving." I closed the book. And for the first time since this all began, I felt like I'd finally come home that night. I recorded a final message for the channel. No script, no editing. Just me, the lake, and the sound of water behind me. I looked into the lens and said, if you've been through something that broke you, don't rush to erase the scars. They're proof that you rebuilt, that you stood back up, that you didn't let someone else write your ending. I paused, feeling the words before I spoke again. People think justice is about punishment. It's not. Justice is about restoration and forgiveness. That's the foundation no one can bulldoze. I smiled, let the silence breathe, and added softly, so don't click away yet. Because if you're still watching, it means your story's not over either. The video ended with a quiet shot of the sunrise over the lake, the same lake that once reflected rubble. Now glowing with gold and calm water. In the comments that followed, people shared their stories of hope, healing, and standing tall after loss. Some said it made them cry. Others said it made them believe again. And for me, that was enough. Not headlines. Not numbers. Just connection. Because in the end, that's what this was always about. Not fighting systems, but rebuilding humanity inside them. The mansion was gone. The lawsuits were done. But what stood in its place was something stronger. A community, legacy, and a reminder that even when everything you love turns to dust, you can still build something beautiful from the ashes. So when people ask me now if I ever miss the old house, I tell them the truth. I don't. Because I built something bigger, not with walls and roofs, but with people and purpose. Maybe that's the real meaning of home. So if you're still watching, thank you. Because you've been part of this story from the start. And maybe, just maybe, it reminded you that no matter how dark it gets, the light is always waiting, just beyond the valley.